Hello everyone, this is Deborah Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. If you are looking for vendor process training for you or your entire vendor team, head over to my site at deborahrrichardson.com and click on the Vendor Team Training Solved button to learn more about what is included in the monthly or annual plan and also to download a 2021 training schedule. Get the training that you and your team needs to avoid payment fraud, duplicate vendors, compliance fines, and more. Think about that back and forth you go through with some vendors to get an accurate IRS Form W-9. Well, in today's episode, we're going to talk about what you should do when that happens. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 130, What to Do When Your Vendor Does Not Know How to Complete the IRS Form W-9. I receive lots of requests and questions on the vendor master file and the vendor onboarding and change process. But this request was different. This request was to see if I had a reference to give to vendors when they didn't know how to complete the IRS Form W-9, which from here on out, I'm just going to call it the W-9. And we've all been there. So I do want to start off with the purpose of the W-9 form, and then I want to talk about vendor common errors when completing the W-9, and then I'll end up with your next steps, like what to do when you're in that situation. So starting with the purpose of the W-9 form. So the title of the W-9 is officially the request for taxpayer identification number and certification. And per the Internal Revenue Service of the IRS, on the instructions for the W-9, it says that an individual or entity, the Form W-9 requester, who is required to file an information return with the IRS must obtain your correct taxpayer identification number, the TIN, which may be your Social Security number, SSN, individual taxpayer identification number, the ITIN, the adoption taxpayer identification number, the ATIN, or the employer identification number, the EIN, to report on an information return the amount paid to you or other amount reportable on an information return. Now, if you were scratching your head over the taxpayer identification numbers or the TINs, the 4 different types, I kind of was too over one of them. So there were 4. It was the Social Security number, which we know is for individuals. It can be sole proprietors, single member LLCs, for companies, or if those sole proprietors, single member LLCs, individuals have employees, they have to have an EIN, and so they could have an SSN or an EIN, or that EIN could be for the company. The ITIN, the individual taxpayer identification number, that's for individuals that for whatever reason, and I don't have all the criteria for that, but for whatever reason they are not eligible for a Social Security number to be issued by the Social Security Administration, and so the IRS will issue an individual taxpayer identification number for them. And then the last one is the one that had me scratching my head because it's an ATIN. It's the adoption taxpayer identification number. And I don't know if this will ever be relevant, but The purpose of that is for example, if a parent adopts a child and that child does not yet have a social security number, but they want to claim them on their taxes, they would apply for an A-10. And I don't know if that would ever be the case with a W-9, but I do know that we are used to seeing that SSN and that EIN, and maybe there's an individual taxpayer identification number in there somewhere. It is also, all of them are 9 digits, and the I-10 is formatted the same as the social security number. So I'm not sure if maybe we've used those in the past and didn't know, but those are the 4 numbers that are part of the taxpayer identification number, or the choices of the taxpayer identification number. Anyway, so I'd like to add to all of that by saying that each and every vendor you onboard, you should require a W-9 be submitted as proof of exemption from either backup withholding and or reporting. So yes, that means corporations or vendors that your company currently expects to pay only $599 or less, because we know everybody knows about that $600 threshold for most types of payments. For some types of payments is less. Not to mention the fact that the successful IRS 10 match can be an indicator that the vendor is not a fraudster. So I do want to say here, as a disclaimer, I am not a tax professional, so please make sure you check with your tax professional before making any decisions on the 1099, the W-9s, the 1099s, and any related tax filings. But it won't hurt anything to collect the W-9 from all of your vendors and then also do the IRS 10 match. It won't hurt anything, but it could help long term if you do decide to pay that vendor more than the threshold, or that corporation turns out to be, provide legal services or any type of medical payments. Those have to be reported regardless. Then you would have it. And don't forget, you probably don't forget, but other people might that are not in AP, that we don't always know what those payments are going to be for. And so you can't make a decision at the time of vendor setup that you don't need to you do not need to collect a W-9 because you're not going to be over the threshold, or these payments don't warrant it. Because in some cases, even though you're buying goods, you might also buy services that are on the same invoice. So any event, it doesn't hurt to require a W-9, and I know a lot of you already do that at the time of vendor setup, but it also doesn't hurt to require a W-9 again when the vendor has changes either. So while the IRS provides verbiage in the W-9 instructions to let the payee know that when there are changes, they need to reach out to the payer and let them know. Well, we know our vendors don't always do this. They typically only reach out if their change somehow triggers an issue with the payment. So for example, if they've sent in their invoices in one name, maybe it's an EDI file they're sending it in, and they've changed their name, then that's gonna throw an error in the EDI file. They won't get paid, so they'll probably report that. But if their invoices are in a DBA and they change their legal name, then they're not going to have an issue, and you may never know. So they typically only reach out if their change somehow triggers an issue with the payment, and then you find out when you go to file, or when you do your vendor master file cleanup and you run the IRS 10 match again and find out that it's no longer a match. So with any of the changes, it's best to ask, especially whenever they submit a change to the information that's included on the W-9, the tax ID, a name change, or even an address. All right, so what are some of the common errors that are seen when completing the W-9? And I'm sure there's more than the 1, 2 that I'm going to talk about here today, but many of you share these same problems. And let's face it, the Verizons of the world know how to complete their W-9s. As a side note, you just need to make sure you get the right one. And most companies will even have the latest version on hand to submit to you before you even ask for it. However, you may have a specific vendor population that is mostly mom and pop or other non-business type vendors, and when you ask them for a W-9, they have never heard of it and definitely don't know how to complete it. So you point them to the form and instructions, which they do not read. But when you remind them that if they don't submit the W-9, you will back up withhold 24% of their payment. So they hear the 24% portion, and then that whole back and forth starts with the right information in the wrong places. So let's talk about two common errors. And I say two errors, but what it really is two errors for each, for two different tax classifications. So let's start with the tax classification, individual, sole proprietor, single member LLC, that first one. So the first common error is line 1. The legal name should be their first name and their last name, yet they enter in the name that is on their invoices, John Doe Lawn Service. Okay, so that's one. Number 2 is line 2. They do not include the name on their invoice, John Doe Lawn Service. So it should be John Doe on line 1, their first and last name, and John Doe Lawn Service on line 2, their DBA or disregarded entity, which, by the way, no one knows what that disregarded entity means on the form. So you probably end up explaining that a lot too. Okay, the second most common error is with tax classification limited liability company. And here are the two errors under that one. The first one is the vendor doesn't think they need to fill out the form because they are quote unquote a limited liability corporation. Don't know how many times I've gotten that in the past. I know you have too, because they think the word is corporation instead of limited liability company. And since they said corporation, they figured they don't need to submit a 1099. So that's one. The second one is that the vendor will select the classification limited liability company, but they don't fill in the letter indicating how they are taxed, either as a C corporation, as a S corporation, or as a partnership. And if you receive a W-9 where that tax classification is selected, but they haven't entered in that letter, you need to send it back, because if it's a C corporation or S corporation, then it's not reportable, but if it's a partnership, it is. And so you need to know whether or not that vendor is reportable, so they need to fill that letter in. Okay, so let's now shift to your next steps. What you can do when your vendor does not know how to complete that W-9. So yes, I know that when you use 10check.com, and if you guys haven't checked it out, check it out. It can really consolidate a lot of your validations into one. And I'm not affiliate of anything with them, but I have used that in the past. I continue to use it when I do vendor master file cleanups for my clients, and it is kind of a one-stop shop for many of the validations. But anyway, I know when you use 10check.com and you input the vendor's legal name and employer identification number, that EIN, that the results will pop up with the vendor's name as registered on the IRS's EIN database, if it's there. Now, it doesn't work with the Social Security number because, again, it's the EIN database. But I don't recommend that you reveal that to your vendor if they have put their made a mistake and put the wrong name in the legal name. Maybe they put their their first name and last name, and didn't put the company name, or maybe they put a company name and it's not the right company name. I mean, you never know. It could be different scenarios, but you know what the actual name is, and it might even be close to what they're doing. Maybe they flip flop between the disregarded entity and the legal name. But I don't recommend that you reveal that to the vendor, because what if they don't know the name because they are a fraudster? So what I would say, because now you have to go back to the vendor because the W-9 is not valid. And so what I would say is that you really have actually four options. The first one is to, once again, point them to the IRS Form W-9 instructions. And if they read it, they should be able to figure out that they need to put a valid vendor legal name on their W-9. And by the way, if they do not remember what their valid legal name is that they registered with the IRS with, for example, those that have that EIN, there is a number that they can call in order to get a copy of their registered employer identification number and legal name. And what they'll get is a letter back. It'll be a 147C, and so they do have a recourse for that. So point them to the IRS Form W-9 instructions. That's one. And then the second one is, and I didn't know this until I was doing some research for an offering that I'll have, and the blog post and this podcast, is that the IRS, on their IRS video portal, they have a video that is called How to Complete the Form W-9, and it is strictly for those vendors that need assistance on how to complete the form. Now, the one thing I will say about it is that it still uses, IRS still uses IRS language, and even though they say disregarded entity, again, vendors may not know what that means. So they're still using IRS language, but there is an IRS video. And by the way, all of these things that I'm talking about, I'll have links to it in the blog post that accompanies this podcast, and I'll have a link to that blog post in the show notes. So that's the second one. Now, the third one is to switch to a substitute W-9 form. And I'll link to a blog post that I did late last year, maybe it was even in 2019, about one reason to switch to a substitute form W-9. And the one reason, I won't keep you in suspense here, the one reason is because you get to get more data, but you really can combine your vendor setup form with your with the IRS W-9. They don't care if you have a substitute. They just want to make sure that you have all the elements that they require, and and I think I have a link within that blog post so that you can verify it. But the substitute W-9 will help you in that, instead of trying to make sure the vendor puts the legal name in the legal name and the DBA in the disregarded entity line, line 2, then you can just ask them, what is the name of your, what is the name that is on your invoices? Bam, they'll put that. What is your first and last name? Bam, they'll put that. What is your tax classification? They'll put that. And if they put sole individual or check individual sole proprietor or single member LLC, that first one, then you know that all you have to do is put the first and last name in with their social security number or their EIN, and you can run the IRS 10 match. And you didn't have to cross your fingers and hope that the vendor was able to put their first name, last name, and their DBA name, that name that's going to be on the invoices, in the right places on the W-9. So that's just food for thought. Now, that was the third one. The fourth and the last one is something that I've just actually created. It was, I talked about it earlier, how I had a request to, if I had some type of document to send to the vendors to help them understand how to complete the W-9. And again, I'm not a proponent of telling them where they need to put their information, but I can definitely take what the IRS provides in Publication 1220 on the IRS W-9 instructions and change that into more layman's terms so that they understand how to complete that form. And what I did is I turned that into not only what I consider a one-pager called the Vendor Non-Official Guidance for Completing the IRS Form W-9. So I created that one-pager, but I also included or created a 26-page document that helps the vendor team know what to look for when they're accepting these W-9s. Because, it could be the case where you may have new vendor team members and not only do the vendors not know how to complete those W-9s, but neither may your vendor team. And so what I created was, it's called the IRS Form W-9 Examples by Tax Classification. It's a non-official guide to train your vendor team. So I'm all about vendor training. It's 26 pages. It comes with a separate PDF, one pager that you can send to your vendors that need assistance completing the W-9. And it also has references for them on that one pager as well. It has the number to the IRS if they need to get a copy of the 147C form we talked about earlier. It has a link to the instructions. It has a link to that video that the IRS put out. And so the whole document, including that separate PDF for the vendors, is taken from all of the IRS guidance related to the W-9. And it's all kind of packaged up into a 26-pager for the vendor team and a one-pager for the vendors. So I'll put a link to that. Again, it'll be in the blog, but I'll put a link to that also in the show notes, and you can take a look and see if you would like to purchase that for your team. All right, so after all of that, so those were your next steps, the four that you can take if your vendor just does not know how to complete the IRS Form W-9. But if nothing worked and you definitely still need to pay the vendor, because don't we all just need to pay the vendor? Sometimes by the time we even get the information, the service has been done, the goods have been received for whatever reason, and we do need to pay the vendor, then go ahead and pay the vendor without the W-9. Try to validate other information to make sure that it is a real vendor, but backup withhold 24% until they submit a valid W-9, so at least you will not get in trouble with the IRS. So thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 130th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.